Good evening, Tom. How are you this fine sunny evening?
I'm very well, Simon. It is fine and sunny here. We've had a couple of days of very good weather. It's super.
Tom, we've had a lot of input this week in our channels at Crime Time Inc. through Twitter and through Facebook, through our website where people leave voice messages from all over for a variety of subjects and a few suggestions that we'll discuss later. But a thread to it seems to be this problem that we had historically where senior detectives, very senior, in charge of major inquiries, sometimes multiple murder inquiries, in a position of trust to run an inquiry that costs millions of pounds sometimes, can go down the wrong road and seemingly put blinkers on and not be open to all the possibilities within that inquiry. I think we should spend some time on that tonight and put these questions to the test here.
I think that's right, Simon. And whereas now there are safeguards against these sort of things, back in our young years as detectives, as we remember well, the senior investigating officer was God. What he said went, absolutely. And as we'll discuss, there are traps to fall into there.
Did you hear the news this week? And I'm sure you have, because it's all over our social media, it's all over our website. People responding to my debut that I made with Small Town Dicks. You put me in touch with them a long time ago. I put them in touch with me. I told them a few stories a while ago now, a couple of months ago now. But I made my debut on Small Town Dicks last week, and it's got some real traction with our Crime Time Inc. audience. Now, I've since found out that you've had 6 items on Small Town Dicks. Tell us a bit about that, Tom, how it came about.
First of all, Simon, I listened to your Small Town Dicks episode and it came across really well. So well done. I've had a long relationship with Small Town Dicks, probably going back 2 or 3 years. I got an email out of the blue from them. I think because of something I'd written, I got in touch with them and agreed to do a podcast with them. And of course, they sent me over all their kit. And I found them a delightful group of people to deal with and very interesting. And in fact, so much so that I signed up to be one of their regular patrons, as they call it. So I get all the episodes a day or so early. And they're very, very good. And of course, the scene is that Small Town Dicks, a dick being anything for a detective, they do talk about small-time crime and the problems of law enforcement officers and law enforcement across the board. It's not just major cases. So I've really enjoyed working with them. And I can't actually remember how many cases I've done with them, but I've done at least half a dozen. And of course, in July, they are doing a 6-part podcast of my book on the Ruxton murders. I'm really looking forward to that. It's the first time they have done a long series of podcasts, so it's new territory for them. But it's been a long time in the producing. Absolutely super, so I'm looking forward to it.
So, Tom, we've referred to Ruxton, the first modern murder, many times on here, and the book has been doing really well here in the UK and further afield too. But I should explain to our listeners that we can't cover it on here on the podcast because of that Small Town Dicks are doing this 6-part series.
What happened was the Small Town Dicks' interest in Ruxton predates Crime Time Inc. They had secured the rights of Ruxton both for podcast and for TV before we came together and before the launch of Crime Time Inc. But I've got to say that it was really the example of Small Town Dicks and enjoying podcasting so much and seeing the potential of podcasting so much that actually was one of the encouragements I had to get into partnership with you guys. I mean, I wouldn't normally deal with people from Glasgow, but...
You're taking your chances, right enough. I can tell you also, you normally wouldn't have lasted this long, but it is virtual, so you've been okay. Tom, the story that you referred to that I did with them, I did 2 or 3 stories. Funnily enough, one of them was about a guy, Paul McCartney, but we'll leave that for another podcast. The story that I did with them was interesting because it seemingly dispelled some of the foundations of crime investigation, i.e. that it's a team game. And we both laugh at programmes that one person within 59 minutes, currently Rebus, I think it is, it's shown on TV, has all this freedom to do as they please and never write anything down. Nobody ever takes any notes or anything, which I think is brilliant. But this case that I told them about flew in the face of that a bit, because everybody knew who was committing these crimes, a series of 134 sexual assaults, attempt rapes, flashings, you name it, and everybody knew who it was. And I wanted to have a fresh look at it, if you like. But the reason I mention it is because the other thing that it flew in the face of was that senior investigating officers in any country, in any environment, and the more serious the crime, the more high the stakes are, can put blinkers on and be blinkered to the wide net that we know has to be thrown in any major investigation to try and capture that tiny elusive part of evidence that starts to point us in the right direction. And in this case that I'm talking about in Rothsay was actually of that ilk, but a whole community, all the police officers, the press, media, everybody on the island knew who was committing these crimes, and they all had blinkers on to the possibility that it might have been someone else. And that's what I want to talk to you about tonight, because it's such a crucial part of what the police do, and it's such a crucial part of cold case investigations that you're an expert in, when you have to come in 10, 20 years, sometimes longer, after the case has been closed to all intents and purposes, and look at it afresh. So I'd like to talk to you about that and your experience of that blinkering, if you like, for want of a better expression, over the years.
That's right, Simon. I think it's a classic case. Your case that you talked about in Rothsay was a very interesting case. I remember when I was out at the FBI Academy, we got a lecture from the captain in the homicide department in New York, NYPD. And he said to us, sometimes, the difference between success and failure is a new idea. That's what he said. And that Rothsay case that you discussed, that was a new idea. Now, it might have been the only new idea you've ever had, Simon, but
That was the last one.
Seriously, you talk about silo thinking, about tunnel thinking. A lot of senior investigating officers that we came up with and we worked for, they were a mixed bunch, but many of them were actually prisoners of their own background and their own experience, or lack of it. Because remember that up until the late 1980s, there was no senior detective training in Scotland. Okay, so after you were a detective sergeant, there was no other formal training, and especially not training to become an SIO. You just learned as you went, and you picked up good and bad habits from the people who you were working with. And what you tended to find was that the SIOs within a particular force came out of a mould, because heads of CID, when they influenced promotions, and of course, often that was left to the force executive, but the head of CID would influence the promotion, they usually influenced the promotion of people that they liked and people that they worked well with. And so you had this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy of the same sort of people in the same kind of jobs.
You're 100% right, of course you are. That's human nature, to bring people through that mirror your thoughts and your ethos and your way of doing things, and people you like. The other part of that is that if we think back to the promotions, I'm not sure about Lothian and Border, obviously, but in Strathclyde, a DC, when he got promoted, would become a uniform sergeant. That was 99% true. And it carried on like that. He would do a year or two in uniform as a sergeant, and of course he might remain there, but he might become a DS during the course of time if he had that particular bent for CID work. And from DS, you would never be promoted. That I can remember anyone being promoted from DS to DI. You would come out of the CID for a spell, which is good. It was all good because you're getting a broad experience of working on the shift and working in uniform and all the different challenges. But you might get to the rank of chief inspector and be in charge of a serious a murder inquiry, whatever the serious inquiry might be. And you've only spent periods of time in the different ranks, and all of a sudden you're in charge of all those ranks and all those resources that are required to pull together the strands of a major investigation.
Yeah, that's right. And we used to do that too, and I always encouraged it. I thought it was great for a good detective constable to become a uniform sergeant and influence and train and direct young cops on his shift. When you speak to detectives, even today, as I do sometimes, they will say, "Oh, I remember he came onto my shift as uniform sergeant and he was absolutely great. He taught us so much about criminal investigation." That was a way of cascading down the tactics, because again, I quote again a famous homicide detective from New York who said that investigating homicide is a craft, and the more experience you have at it, the better you get. He was right, of course. And this is where often we came unstuck in Scotland. In our time, not so much now, in our time, when we had so many small forces. The trouble was that pride prevented smaller forces from asking for help. And I remember a very challenging experience I had. There was a difficult, what looked to be a difficult murder in a small force. I'm not going to name the force. And I phoned up my counterpart there, who I knew very well, counted as a friend. And I said, listen, I've got a really good detective super I can send to you. It was actually Roger Orr, the man who cleared up the Robert Black case. He was a first-class guy. I said, look, I can send him up to you. My counterpart in the other force said, oh, Tommy said, I'd like nothing better. He said, but the politics won't allow me. He said, the politics won't allow me. And that case, Simon, remains unsolved to this day.
Because the one rider that I was going to put on all of that was that we were still good at it. We still were good at major inquiries. In Strathclyde, we maybe had one a year that slipped through the net, and that always was a bugbear for everyone. But we were good at it. I don't want to give the impression here, Tom, to our listeners, that we were flapping about and not knowing what we were doing. The reason we were successful is because we took it so seriously. People devoted their lives to these inquiries and to clearing up these heinous crimes. Okay, most murders are solved within hours, within the day, because they're domestic or whatever. But those whodunits that we're talking about, we cleared up most of them.
I've just completed another book on the World's End murders, the murder case that I ended up leading way back. But that started out in 1977. And I had the benefit of looking back over these case files and looking back at the original statements and looking back at what minutes were available from the senior officers' conferences. And I can tell you that there was a detective super and 2 DCIs involved in that case, all very different men, all completely untrained, formally untrained, and yet I could not really say that they had made any mistakes because the pride of the matter was there. So I couldn't honestly say they were untrained and here's a telltale, here's something they didn't do right. Anything that they didn't do right was because they did not have the equipment or the knowledge or the learning or the forensic science to do it otherwise. But actually...
Like the murder in Paisley that we spoke about with Jane Hamilton recently, the Daily Record reporter, that everything was done, and I was on that inquiry as a young detective constable, and everything was thrown at that inquiry, and we couldn't understand why we hadn't got a break of the ball somewhere. Because as you and I know, it's a relentless task of sifting and sorting and sifting and sorting. And if you do it properly, if you do it methodically and consistently and question each other at every stage, then it's going to pop out. The answer pops out somewhere if you keep your focus on it. And it just didn't do it in that case. But as we now know, for the reasons you've just cited, we would never have caught him. He would never have came within our net because he had appeared on a bus or a train or whatever from your neck of the woods, sneaky people that they are through there, and disappeared again probably the same day. The one that I wanted to refer you to, I don't know if you had any knowledge of it, was a cold case and it went to court in 2014 and got a conviction. And that was the Elaine Doyle murder, Tom, in Greenock. 1986. It's one that I was involved in on the peripheral only. I wasn't part of the team. But as always with these things, you get drafted in now and again to help with putting a door in or searching a house or whatever it might be, or some actions that might have been elsewhere in Glasgow or whatever that have got to be followed up. The theory at the time was, and all the detectives felt, that the senior investigating officer had put the blinkers on and had decided prematurely. Are you aware of this, Tom? Do you know anything about this case?
No, I don't know about it. I've heard the name, of course, but I don't know. One thing I was going to add to what you're going to say is we forget, and it's the opening line to my book on the World's End, actually. All these years later, we forget all that we did not know and could not do back 40 years ago. And the one thing that comes shining through the review of the World's End is how handicapped we were by our lack of a computerised index system. We forget, in complex cases, we forget just what a handicap that was. Any crime or crime fiction, and you watch on television, it's all about forensic science and DNA. And rightly so, because it's fantastic. It's wonderful. It's opened a whole new chapter in criminal investigation. But computers aren't sexy, except to our producer, Chris, of course. But computers aren't sexy, but actually the home system and computerized index systems generally have added a tremendous amount to criminal investigation because they keep you straight. They don't allow you to go down that one-way road, that one-way street.
Add 2 and 2 together, get 5, and take everyone down that road because you've got a hunch, because you've got a theory. The interesting thing with Elaine Doyle, I'll just explain for our listeners a wee bit about Elaine Doyle. Elaine Doyle was a 16-year-old living in Greenock at the time. This was in the 2nd of June 1986, and she was out with friends. I think it was a Sunday night, it might have been the Saturday night. She was at the Celtic Club as usual with friends. She'd had a few drinks, as had her friends, but they weren't drunk by any stretch. She refused a lift home and decided to walk home, a 15-minute walk from the town centre, and she was found in the lane very close to her Gown Street where she lived in Greenock, and she was found naked. Her clothes were folded nearby, her shoes and clothes were all on top of each other, folded nearby, and she was on her side, and she had been strangled by a ligature in the lane there. She was found in the morning. The big flaw at the time was that the first uniform cop at the locus threw a blanket over her to protect her modesty. Misguided, of course. And the point I'm going to make is that when it went to court in 2014, Donald Finlay was defending. Donald Finlay produced 41 names. It's a real Finlay trick, of course, but perfectly legitimate. And those 41 names, all designed to distract the jury, of course. But for each one of those 41, he had done his cold case review and had gone back to the files. And what he was saying was that any one of these could have done it just as easily as the guy that we had in the dock for it. And he had a legitimate point, obviously, because he's Donald Finlay. He wouldn't have produced it if it didn't have some substance. But you could look at these guys and say, well, wait a minute, why wasn't he looked at more closely? Why wasn't that ruled out? Why was that alibi not checked out properly? In the end of the day, thankfully, the DNA clinched it for the jury. The fact that the accused DNA was found. And it was found on the back of the wee girl, Elaine Doyle, and she'd been strangled from behind. So it was very, very incriminating, and he got convicted of it quite rightly. But you see my point, because at the time, routes weren't followed, because nowadays we have to think, we have to rule out, not just go down one route and prove a murder case, we have to rule out all the possibilities round about that, because the defence have got access to all the information.
Yeah, that's right, disclosure. And funnily enough, that put me in mind of Hector Clark. I've spoken about Hector Clark, my old boss, who was in charge of the Robert Black case. Once Robert Black was arrested for the abduction in the Borders and the subsequent murders of Caroline Hogg and Susan Maxwell, which we've done Crime Time Inc. podcasts about, well, worth listening to them again. What he did was he attacked it from the other way. He eliminated all other possibilities other than Robert Black, that it could not have been anyone else except him. And all the other murders that Black was suspected of, he took the same approach. He eliminated everybody else. And of course, once Robert Black had been arrested, you can imagine any force with an unsolved murder of a young girl came for, oh, must be him, must be him. And Hector was fastidious because of just that problem and because of just that threat. But there's been one or two classic examples. Murder in the Valleys. There was a very good television documentary drama documentary about it, which showed how the SIO in a case, I think it was a double murder of young women, had his eyes fixed on one person and would not budge and would not consider anything else. And then, of course, the classic one is the Yorkshire Ripper, where the tape message by so-called Wearside Jack, this man who came on here with a Wearside accent, taunting the SIO, and the whole investigation turned to someone with a Wearside accent. And of course, Peter Sutcliffe slipped through the net, not once, not twice, not 3 times, but something like 9 times. They're the classic cases of tunnel vision and being able to really ask the question. And the killer question always, and it's about reviewing your hypothesis of what happened. And every day, as an SIO, you've got to go into the squad room and say, right, guys, what else could it be? What else could it be? And I don't want to prejudge on public inquiries that are upcoming, But there is a public inquiry into a historic murder which is going to take place in Scotland very shortly. And in fact, I more than guess that will be the nub of it. That question was not asked. What else could it be?
Also a part of that, and it's something else we've referred to on here before and both experienced, is that there's a bias, a victim assumption, because the victim might be a prostitute or might be whatever it might be, that right from the outset there's a bias fixed into the inquiry that doesn't do it any good. It narrows anything that narrows the inquiry is not beneficial to the inquiry at all.
Yeah. I learned the lesson. I went to the FBI Academy in 1987. I was a detective super, and they had first of all, I was a bit alarmed by it because they would invite people.
Tom, do you know that you mentioned your trip to the FBI almost as much as I mentioned me meeting Paul McCartney?
I hope I mention it more because it's meaningful. So that's all right.
It's true.
But anyway,
I thought you were going to say because it's true there.
One of the things they used to do was they used to invite people to come and speak to the Academy group, which is about 200 strong, not to celebrate their victories, but to analyse their defeats. They would not invite people to talk about how they'd captured this one and captured that one. There was a little bit of that, but not much. But what they did invite with people and to talk about, to share the experiences and the mistakes they had made. And I thought it was a horrific experience for some of these people, because obviously they were reliving their own failure and their own anxiety, and some of their failures had ended in death. There was one, I'll never forget it, there was one guy who came and lectured us about a horrendous shooting incident down in Miami where some of his colleagues had been shot by an armed gang of Haitians, and they'd used high-powered rifles, and that was the key to it, that the FBI firearms tactics were completely obsolete because of these new weapons that these gangsters had. And he came and talked about it, and seeing, I think there were 3 or 4 agents killed in the one shootout, which was the most they'd ever lost. I said to the instructor afterwards, I said, really, felt a bit uncomfortable for the guy. He says, no, he says, it's part of his therapy. He said, it's actually good for him to talk about it and relive it. We don't do it unthinkingly. We do it as part of this guy's recovery therapy. So it was interesting. We didn't do that. We didn't tend to talk about our failures, and we certainly didn't share them as we perhaps should have done, because you can learn more from somebody else's mistakes than you can from their successes. And that's a thing I regret. And I think it's very different now, but that was certainly the case when I was a young detective.
2 things there, Tom. One is the old saying that if you've never made a mistake, you've never actually done anything. That's how we learn, is how we, and we only do that by sharing and talking. You asked me to speak to the Federation about it too, is utilising resources like you. Just now, in modern Police Scotland, what harm would it do to have some advisors or a team of advisors on the wings who would gladly help in any capacity? It's this inability to ask for help and to have one person in total control of the whole inquiry. I really do think it's had its time in this day and age when there must be so many avenues to go down with CCTV, mobile phones, seized computers, all the digital stuff going on. I don't think any one man, i.e. an SIO, can reasonably have a grasp of all of that now, Tom.
I agree absolutely with the principle of what you're saying. I think perhaps you and I are both a little bit more out of time, frankly. We are historic relics, you more than me, but we really are, we're relics. But their systems now are so much, much better. The Homicide Review Board that they have now oversees all homicide operations, and Police Scotland has many faults. It really does, and I think we've lost a lot in terms of local policing and local accountability. But the one thing you've got to say is that a large force like Police Scotland allows you to have the very best of major investigation teams at hand to respond to these things. And I think the major investigation team system in Police Scotland is very good indeed. And I've experienced it because just last year I gave evidence at the High Court in Aberdeen for a historic case which I was involved in way back in the late 70s. And I saw how they had worked through the cold case and what they had done. And one of the reasons why we're getting so much success with cold cases, very cold cases now, is because of the system they've got. For a start, you've got to be qualified to be an SIO. For two, you've got a team ready to start. You've got able detectives, experienced detectives who can hit the ground running. And you'll remember, and I remember, in the World's End case particularly, I was a detective sergeant on duty that afternoon where the bodies of Helen and Christine were found. And I spent the whole afternoon looking for cars and calling out people. Now, I just called out people from a sheet. Whether they were the best people to call out, I'm not sure. But they were the people who picked up the phone. And office space and all of that had to be found. So there was this gap of about 12 hours before the wheels started to turn. Nowadays, that's not happened. They've got dedicated suites. The other day there, when we were you and I were both at the celebration of Fetties at 50, when we were at the old Fetties headquarters of Lothian and Borders Police. What used to be the force operations room is now a major incident suite, which is all set up and ready to go. She's literally just come in and turn on the switch, and it's all ready to go. They also have a system of reviews, which I think is very good in that once, I think it's 4 or 5 weeks have passed, then a different team of SIOs come in and have a look at it. And because they're all used to that system, there's no resentment. They know it's going to happen. And one day you will be having your work reviewed, and the next day you will be doing the reviewing. So it's just part of the system which they are used to. And there's also, and I remember speaking to the chief super there, and he told me that the one thing they do is every day and daily, they go into the squadron and say, what else could it be? Testing this hypothesis. So they don't go down the rabbit hole that some of our predecessors did.
That's very reassuring, Tom, for me, and I'm sure it is for a lot of our listeners to Crime Time Inc., that we've progressed that far, because it makes perfect sense, especially the reviewing, and you know that your work is going to be reviewed and that you're going to be reviewing someone else's work. Imagine you had said to some of your SIOs back in the day that you were going to come in and review some of their work. I'm laughing at how stupid that would have been to even think that because there was a real pride about it's their inquiry, end of story. And no one else's. That's good to know that's going on now.
I think there's only really one or two. The one I mentioned before, I'm not going to name it, the one I mentioned before, I think they've got a suspect that he's in prison, but they've cleared up tremendously. They cleared up the McRae case in Inverness after 40 odd years.
Yeah.
A case that was unsolvable, and yet they took it and they picked it apart and they subjected it to the latest forensic science, and then they went and re-interviewed witnesses. We've spoken about this before, but it's worth repeating. Actually, back in the day, how bad some of us were at interviewing witnesses. Interviewing a witness for a robbery is entirely different from interviewing a witness for a murder. And so what they did was they went back and they interviewed some of these witnesses 40 years later, those who were alive, and actually they got additional information. So
explain that for our listeners, because I understood intuitively exactly what you said there. That interviewing someone who's a potential witness to a robbery is entirely different from taking a statement from a potential murder witness. I think we need to explain that for Crime Time Inc. listeners there.
Yeah. The thing about interviewing someone for a robbery is that statement is usually not going to be cross-referenced with 100 other statements taken by other people. It's a statement of fact of what they saw, where they were, descriptions, etc. But if you're taking a statement from a witness for a murder, describing and defining a single piece of a jigsaw, because you know that will fit in that statement, and what that person has seen will fit in along with hundreds and sometimes thousands of other statements. So it's very important. We'll both have experienced it, because the first murder investigation you're on, you go out and take a statement and you come back with your page and a half or your 2 pages. And hopefully a kindly admin sergeant, sometimes not so kindly admin sergeant, will take you aside and say, Tom, listen, here's the deal. Go back and interview this person again and do it properly this time.
I'm laughing, Tom, because in my case it wasn't the admin sergeant. It was none other than the chief super, Charlie Craig. Maybe not my first day in the squad, but it was the first statement that I ever took, and it was a murder inquiry down in Paisley. To my surprise, when I came on shift in the morning, I was summoned to the chief super's room in Pitt Street, and it was none other than Charlie Craig. Did you know Charlie?
Mm-hmm.
You can imagine the conversation, and he was so dry, wasn't he? He was so funny. But I didn't know he was being funny at the time. And he sat me down. I'll give him his due. He sat me down and explained to me that a statement that I would take at the locus of a housebreaking in uniform would be different from the statement I would take in the morning when I went along as a detective. And likewise, the statement that I was expected to take as a serious crime squad officer was entirely different from that. And it didn't matter how long I was there. It didn't matter how long it took. But this was the standard of statement. And he made me go away and read a couple of statements. And believe me, it stood me in good stead in the years to come, statement taken, especially when I could dictate them, because it was a typist that was going to have to type them all up. But it's as much the questions. The SIO needs to know the questions you've asked. Did you see a car? No, I didn't see a car. You have to write down, did you see a car? No, I didn't. You have to write the negatives down so that the person reading it knows that the question's been asked. That's the whole essence of the thing. Otherwise, he's going to have to come back to you and say, did you ask him if he had a car? Oh, I never had a car, boss. Put it in the statement now.
I think I've mentioned before, my first DCI was a man called Bert Darling, who was a very fastidious guy. He was one of the early SIOs on the World's End murders, funnily enough. But Bert had this belief that the answers usually lay in the first 50 statements. And so much so that he would read the first 50 statements, he would make notes on them, then he would ask completely different people to go back and re-interview the witnesses. And he would maybe do that again. So convinced was he that the answer lay in the first 50 statements. And he was right on numerous occasions. He was right.
That's the great thing about a result, isn't it? You can look back at the whole inquiry and say, there's the turn we made when we maybe should have done this or done that or done the next thing.
But Simon, the point is there was no formal debriefing at all. That message was never passed down. It was only passed down by experience and by word of mouth. There was no formal way of sharing that kind of experience. And I think we suffered for that. Now, you can't change history, and it's very difficult to look back and make judgments on folk. Because, as you've said, and you're right, we were actually hugely successful. But that information, that learning, was never cascaded down satisfactorily in our young years.
Taking statements, thoroughness of statements, going back to witnesses, the methodology of taking a statement, which we've never gone into here, and which is a whole field of police work in its own that we would call interrogation, if you like. But it really is an art form. I remember, as a young detective again, learning how to ask one question, and then what happened. It's a neutral question, because the biggest danger for anybody interrogating, and you learn this with kids when you talk to kids, the last thing you want to do is to put something in their head. What height do you think he was? Do you think he was small? Oh yeah, he was definitely small. You could have said enormous, and they would have agreed with that as well. So it's that neutral, closed question that doesn't allow you to put the idea into the witness's head. And that question, and then what happened, is so neutral that I latched onto it and used it forevermore.
I worked with an old DS, and after he'd taken a statement in a major case, the next day he would always track back and go and see people again. So thanks very much for that. Is there anything else you've thought of? It was amazing the number of times people said, funny enough, yeah, there was. Now, they wouldn't have phoned the police station. They wouldn't have made contact. It was just a tactic that he had, and which I learned from. But the point I'm making, Simon, is that you learn these things, I learned these things, but if you hadn't happened to be sitting next to the guy in the pub, if I hadn't happened to be working with that particularly able old detective sergeant, you wouldn't have learned it. It comes back to this. I know I keep repeating it, good people and good systems, but there was no systematic way of passing that information down. That's one of the things I enjoy. And I know that's one of the things the listening audience enjoys about Crime Time Inc. is because they've read all about investigation of crime, etc. But actually, they find it quite tricky that we will discuss something and it will drop a penny, and they'll say, oh, no, I never thought about that. I never thought about that.
Yeah, because it's just human nature most of the time, isn't it? Once you know it, and you think, of course, that's the case. Sometimes people look at things and say, well, that was obvious. Obviously, you should have done that. Obviously, you should have had oversight of the inquiry. Obviously this and obviously that. And every cop operated differently. I used to work with a detective sergeant, and he would meticulously take the statement from the beginning. Right at the beginning, I was born in 1954 by caesarean section, and he was meticulous, and you couldn't fault the statement that came out the end of it. But it was entirely different from what, and I know that I annoyed him the same when I took the statement, because I like to go through the whole thing straight away, to run through the summary of the statement so that I could identify where the really important bits were. But that's just two different ways of operating. As long as you get the statement at the end of the day. Our producer that you referred to earlier told me a story. Chris told me about basketball was started in 1890 apparently. And at that time, they didn't have a net to throw the ball into. They threw it into a basket, a peach basket. And that was the game. And it took them years, Tom, for somebody to say, hang on, we could use a net instead. Much more available, and we can use the nets again and again. So they used the net, climbed up and got the ball back. Every time the ball went in the net, they had to bring the wee ladder out, and somebody went up and got the... And it took another 6 years for somebody to think, hang on, we could put a hole in the bottom of that net, and we don't need the ladder anymore.
That's a great story. I had no idea that basketball was invented in Glasgow. There we go.
There you are. There's lots about Glasgow you don't know. And you know why I know that? Because if you did, you'd be here.
I'm a young man. Maybe I'll make it one day. You never know. It's strange because one of the characteristics of a good SIO is pride and ownership of his crime and of his area. But without the systems of checks and balances, that can work against you. And it worked against some very fine detectives. And I remember, I'm not going to name his name, but I remember hearing a very fine major case detective who I knew, talking about an unsolved crime and saying, if I meet the accused, I'll know him. I'll know. And I thought to myself, that rang alarm bells with me even then. I was a DS. And I thought to myself, you're past that point. You're into delusion now. Because you cannot tell by looking at someone anything. The worst man I ever met in my life, Angus Sinclair, the most violent, the most predatory man in recent Scottish history, in my view, you'd have walked by him 99 times in the street, never looked his way. Never looked his way.
Yep.
He was a little grey, completely anonymous wee man. You would never have thought that he was as dangerous as he was. Never.
And that's brought us full circle, Tom. I remember the Rossi case that we started this podcast with chatting about earlier on. And when I eventually met him, and he had terrorised the town and a lot of other places as it transpired, and in my head, he'd become a monster. Do you know that way? I couldn't wait to see him in handcuffs and get him locked up. And in my imagination, he had become this beast. And all the terms that the newspapers would use to describe someone like that. And he was the most insignificant. He was as much a victim as anyone. He couldn't look you in the eye. I don't think he ever looked at me. He couldn't lift his head. He was a nothing. The lowest self-esteem you could imagine. You know one we never mentioned tonight, Tom? We never mentioned Bible John. And it stands out as a real case of, maybe not the SIO, but driven by the press, how the public were led up the garden path. And the chances of catching the culprit, the real culprit, diminish the more you go down the wrong road.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I think actually I've written about this in my new book about the world's end, but what I term as the ghost of Bible John affected the thinking of an awful lot of senior detectives in the 1980s because they did not want to be caught in the same trap of hunting a media figure, a sort of Jack the Ripper figure who did not exist. And I think there was a lot of realisation about the mistakes that had been made in the so-called Bible John murders, and I've never accepted that 3 murders were committed by the same person. I don't think they were. But there was a real understanding in the SIOs that I knew in the 1980s of mistakes that made and a determination that they were not going to be caught out the same way, and therefore they did not link crimes together that perhaps should have been. for fear of starting another witch hunt, which they would lose control of. The last thing any senior investigating officer wants to be doing is reacting to the press and not actually proactively directing the investigation, because you find yourself in a tailspin from which there is no recovery.
It just shows you, Tom, that you make one mistake of a linkage or whatever it might have been, whoever the link was with the press at that time, but you make one mistake and the ramifications of that mistake can go on for generations. It can influence the way police operate in future. I suppose it's the same in every profession, in every walk of life. By doing things wrong, then that becomes the norm and becomes accepted. And that's one of the lessons that we have to learn, is to always be looking at our systems, always be looking at our methodology, and always be willing to talk about it frankly like we do here.
But it's not just the police. I don't know if you've been watching the recent public inquiry into the blood scandal. That's exactly what happened there. That's exactly what happened. There was no candour. There was no system whereby people could, hang on a minute, what's happening here? Stop, stop, stop. It became a sort of runaway train. And as a consequence of that, hundreds of people died. It's been actually a revelation watching the inquiry, because of the tremendous capability of these King's Counsels who are doing the investigation. But it makes you cringe to think that it could have been you and I or one of our family who needed a blood transfusion for whatever reason and is given poisoned blood, which some people in the medical profession clearly knew about or suspected.
And it's difficult to talk about that without immediately thinking about the Horizon inquiry as well, Tom. These are major malfunctions in our establishments, and especially here with the legal establishment, when people were convicted and put in prison on the say-so of that evidence, which was clearly flawed.
I have written about that, and I've a very strong view about that, because when I was in the Serious Crime Squad in the 80s, I worked a lot with the old Post Office Investigation Branch, because we had a lot of post office robberies. And I worked a lot with them, and I gained a lot of respect for them, because they were old post office men steeped in the work of the post office, which is a sort of world in itself. Huge enterprise at that time, and it was absolutely massive. And these were very, very experienced hands. They were good investigators, and they knew their people. And in the late 80s, early 90s, just before the Horizon scandal broke, they were all dispensed with in a cost-cutting exercise. And they brought in cheaper people, who I would describe as headhunters. And I went out of that business anyway, and I didn't have as much to do with them. But I think if that old original Post Office Investigation Branch had been there, I'm convinced they would have said, wait, hang on a minute. Here you've got all this dishonesty, which is suddenly coming to light, where before there was nothing. And we've got a new computer system. Hang on a minute. Could there be a connection?
That's brilliant, Tom. That's almost a hole in the basketball net scenario right there, isn't it? Let's just take stock here a minute and think, could we do this differently?
Yeah, the big question is, what's changed? It's like something breaks down in your house. What's the last job I did? And could it, in a car, if you're tuning up an old car, as I do, and something doesn't work, what's the last thing I did? What's the last thing I fiddled with? What's the last wire I moved? You go back to it and you inevitably find that's where your problem lies.
We put a new computer system in.
And guess what? Has anybody put a new computer system in where there were not glitches in the whole wide world?
That's great, Tom. Thanks for doing that, because here at Crime Time Inc., we sometimes take it for granted, and I know that I can be guilty of being a bit facetious, but we do take it for granted that we have your experience and knowledge on here, as having been in charge of so many major inquiries over the years in the senior rank. Tom, we've got a big promotion next week. We've got a big day for you. You'll need to go outdoors. I've never seen you outdoors for a long time, since Fetties. And you're actually going to have to travel through to God's country here in the West, because you've got a big day next Sunday in Hillhead Library in the West End of Glasgow. Do you want to tell our listeners a wee bit about it?
That's right, indeed I have. At 2:30 next Sunday, the 23rd June, is going to be the Glasgow launch of The World's End Murders, The Inside Story. It's a brand new, really in detail look at the 37-year investigation of the World's End Murders. It's got a lot of new material in it, and I'm looking forward to the book, and I'm looking forward to a good session next Sunday at Hillhead Library, 23rd, 2:30. Come along.
That's Hillhead Library on Byers Road in Glasgow, and it's a free admission. You can turn up on the day. The book will be there. It will be the first time it's been available to the public, and maybe even get Tom to sign it. Looking forward to it, Tom. Thanks.
Next time on Crime Time Inc.
And my mother picked up the phone, and the mafia lawyer said to my mother, "If your husband goes on television, we're going to kill you and your children." And I took the tape to my local FBI agent. We know all about the threat to kill you and your family. Rip that tape up, burn it. Go home and tell your father to lick his wounds and get on with his life, or they will kill you, and we don't care.